Good evening and welcome to Finger Lakes Wine Month's virtual tasting. We're going to be celebrating Finger Lakes Wine Month in the whole month of May, and this is kind of a kickoff for it this evening. We've got some great, exciting Finger Lakes Vinifera Reds tonight and a great panel of winemakers and owners. And following along with our tasting tonight, we have people from Connecticut, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, California, New Hampshire, Texas, and Massachusetts. And so we have people from all over the United States going to be tasting with us this evening. And how it's going to work on our end is we're going to have our first three panelists that are going to discuss their wines, and we'll take questions via Twitter. And then we'll take a small break after we speak with each one of the winemakers, and we'll come back and do our second flight of three wines. First up this evening, we're going to start out with a longtime Finger Lakes winemaker and also a good friend of mine, Peter Bell. Peter has been making great wine in the Finger Lakes for a number of years, and he's someone that a lot of us look up to. He's just does a wonderful job, and he's going to be pouring his 2010 Lemberger tonight. And Peter, with no further ado, you want to get our tasting started off and tell us a little bit about how you made that Lemberger, and maybe talk a little bit about the 2010 vintage and how that wine came to be.
Sure, thanks, Jeff, and you're my friend too.
Oh, thanks. I feel good about that now.
2010 is a year everybody in the Finger Lakes feels very happy about, because it's a year when the red grapes and the white grapes ripened very, very well. Often there are years when one does well and the other doesn't do so well, but in 2010 everything came through really well. Nice and warm, pretty dry, rain at the right time, and when we can pull off some really good reds, we're fantastically happy. So here's an example of our Lemberger from Finger Lakes, obviously. By the way, there's this grape has a couple of different names: Blau Frankish, Lemberger. There's a couple others out there. We choose to call it Lemberger, and it's the same grape. So does very well in the Finger Lakes because for a number of reasons. It's got very thick skins. The clusters are loose. It has very good disease resistance as a consequence of loose clusters and thick skins. And what I like to tell people is that the voracious turkeys and deer stay away from this grape. We're not quite sure why, but they just leave it alone. They go after Pinot Noir. They go after Gewürztraminer. They go after Riesling. In this case, they leave the grapes alone, and we can let them hang and hang. So here's a wine that has lots of good color. It's been barrel aged, French and American oak, and kind of typical. We'll see how the other two look beside it, but typical Finger Lakes Lemberger, jammy, spicy, rich, some good tannins. That's about all I want to say at this point.
Very good. Couple of questions that people had asked specifically for Fox Run. Someone had mentioned that Lemberger was thought to be a clone of Gamay, and that had since been dispelled, and they had asked if Fox Run had ever thought about planting Gamay.
Right. I have never heard that Gamay and Lemberger had been mixed up from a derivation point of view, but in any case, Gamay is an interesting subject of conversation because we're talking about a couple of different grapes here. Gamay Beaujolais is a clone of Pinot Noir, and the other one is Gamay Noir, and Gamay Noir au Jus Blanc, which is very common in Ontario, Canada, which is not that far away from us. We have tried that in the Finger Lakes in a number of sites, and it doesn't do particularly well. So I'm going to say Lemberger is a much, much stronger grape compared to Gamay.
For those of you following at home, Peter and Fox Run are on the west side of Seneca Lake. Someone had questioned whether or not you find, Peter, that Lemberger grows more successfully on that site for you than Pinot Noir, or what your impressions were of those two grapes. Which one grew better on your own site?
Sure, good question. I'm going to generalize. I'm going to say in the Finger Lakes as a region, Lemberger is a much more successful grape, easier to grow. The best Pinot Noirs are fantastic. You're going to taste some in a couple of minutes. They're brilliant, but it's harder to grow Pinot Noir than Lemberger. And why is that? It's because it's harder to grow Pinot Noir anywhere in the world. Okay, it's a very tough grape to grow.
Very good. And Peter, I think I forgot to ask, as I quite often do. Could you tell me what the suggested retail price of that wine is, and in general, where folks might be able to find it?
Yeah, it's about $20, and we distribute through Empire, and you can find it in the New York City area and in the Finger Lakes as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Peter, and we are going to move on to our second panelist tonight. And next up, we are going to have Dave Peterson from Goose Watch Winery. Dave is the owner of Goose Watch and also of Swedish Hill Vineyards, and is another longtime veteran in the Finger Lakes that has served just about every hat with his operations that there is in the business. And Dave brings a wealth of knowledge to the region, and he should have some good insights for you this evening. Thank you very much for coming tonight, Dave. And Dave's going to be pouring tasting with you folks his 2011 Lemberger. Dave, you want to tell us a little bit about how that wine was made and a little bit about the 2011 vintage, maybe a little about how that would vary for folks tasting it with Peter's 2010.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. It's Lemberger's grape that we've liked for a long time, and I credit Dr. Thomas Hennickling, who used to work at the experiment station in Geneva a number of years ago, for bringing this grape and this wine to the attention of Finger Lakes winemakers. We got in on it early, as did Fox Run. I think we might have just beat them by a year or two at the most as far as planting it, but we've grown this grape since the early 90s. This particular vineyard that the wine is made from comes from our Goose Watch farm. That was this vineyard was planted in 1998, so it does have a few years. Lemberger's an interesting grape, and it's quite a bit different actually than some of the other varietal reds that we grow. It has quite a bit of vigor and very large leaves, which sometimes makes it challenging as far as keeping the canopy or the fruit exposed to sunlight. So that's one of the goals certainly with any of these red varieties, and keep in mind we are growing in a cool climate. These wines express a lot of fruit, but they need that sort of sunlight exposure that comes with that. So we do use a training system called Scott Henry that was developed in Oregon. That's a vertically divided canopy, so it sort of moves things around to get more fruit exposure, and we also employ some leaf pulling. Lemberger also doesn't like wet soils, so we do use soil drainage. We have drainage tile in every single row in this particular vineyard. This is from a 2.5 acre block, again, that was planted in the late 90s. So as Peter described, it's a grape that holds up well in a year where there's a lot of moisture near harvest time, and that was the case in 2011. In a lot of ways, 2011 was looking a bit like 2010. It was a relatively warm summer. We were heading into a relatively early harvest, and I think early to mid-September the faucets came on in a lot of the Finger Lakes, and there was some variation as to who got more rain, but this is a very durable variety when it comes to the rainfall. And we were able to let it hang even in a year when a lot of other varieties didn't necessarily hang particularly well. It was picked on the 17th of October, which is fairly normal harvest time for us, and had good sugars, just under 22 bricks, nice ripe flavors. One of the things we see with Lemberger is sort of a progression in flavors, and the tannins can be a little bit green. It's not particularly herbaceous variety most of the time, but it can be pretty black peppery. And then that black pepper sort of becomes a little more in the background, I think, as it gets riper. So, and then you see some of these cherry and berry fruit flavors start to come out. I think there's a lot of fruit in the 11s. Granted, there was quite a bit of rain, and there might not be as much tannin as we see from some of the 2010 reds, but I think this fits into the cool climate structure that we can expect from a variety like this. And if I had to rate one variety that year in and year out is the most consistent of the reds that we do, I think it's pretty hard to beat Lemberger.
That's pretty good endorsement for it. Someone had asked a question, Dave, specifically about that wine, whether you felt it was ready to drink now or you felt folks should cellar the wine.
I think a lot of the things that I like in Lemberger are there when they're young. I don't think it needs to be aged for a long time. I think a question like that with a wine like this, the tannins aren't such that I think that it needs aging from that standpoint. I think the answer might be more, do you like aged flavors better, or do you like the fruit in that wine now? And personally, I really enjoy the fruit flavors in Lemberger as a younger wine. There are others that I might think are better candidates maybe for aging.
Very good. How much does that one cost, Dave?
That's 17 is the retail. It's distributed throughout New York, similar to what Peter said, distributed upstate by the same distributor they are, Empire, and then distributed in the metro New York City market by DeSalvo. Okay.
And this question, you'll have to forgive me for 1 second. This is a question that came in that isn't specific to Lemberger. Someone had wondered whether there was room for red hybrid and Labrusca grape varietals to be taken seriously, or whether the Finger Lakes should be focusing on all vinifera wines. And I wanted to ask you your opinion on that.
Me?
I'll go with Dave. You're welcome to throw yours in too.
I heard my name and I...
You can chime in, of course. But yeah, that's a loaded question of sorts. It's a very polarizing question, I suppose. I guess I view the hybrids and the Labruscas or natives as being somewhat different. I'd sort of look at the natives in this region as sort of the equivalent to the California white zins and Moscatos and now sweet reds that are going on. So do I think they're going to go away? I think they're going to continue to play that same role that California has its sort of equivalent sweeter, fruity wines. As far as the hybrids, I think there's some evolution with the increasing availability of vinifera varietals and a focus on a lot of varietals. I think that they're a little bit more in question. I think some of the red hybrids will be blended with Labruscas for the sweeter market. And I think that if we're going to make some maybe nice value price blends, hybrids and viniferas blended together might fit into that sort of $10 to $12, maybe even $14 market, depending on what wines we're talking about. And the interest in blends, I think, continues to be there.
Okay. One more, we had a couple of tweets that had came in, and one, I think you kind of answered it, both Peter and Dave. They'd asked whether the challenges with Lemberger come more in the vineyard or the cellar. Doesn't sound like there are that many challenges. It sounds like it makes good wine. But it doesn't sound like it's particularly challenging in the vineyard, from what you guys had both said.
No, not at all.
I think it's certainly relative to Pinot Noir or something like that. I think it's certainly easier in the vineyard. Cab Franc arguably is as easy or easier in the vineyard, but I think in terms of the consistently ripe fruit and what we can expect from the wine, I think Lemberger's a no-brainer for us.
And then, if I might add, as a winemaker, the biggest challenge with Lemberger is high acid.
Okay.
Year to year, and it's easy enough to deal with that. We just need to acknowledge it, and that's true wherever Lemberger is grown. No matter what you call it, no matter where you grow it, the gas is going to be on the tangy side. You can either accommodate that with some adjustment in the winery, or you can just let it happen and make it sort of tangy wine, which is fine for some people.
Okay. Does any of the three of you know how much Lemberger is planted in the Finger Lakes, and what's the price per ton relative to some of the other vinifera reds?
I don't know. I don't think there's a lot of acres. I would say less than 100, but the price per ton, I'm going to say is around 1,500, I think, 1,400, 1,500.
So it's in that same range as a lot of the other.
Yeah, maybe a little bit below Cab Franc.
Mhm.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dave. Got some great information for us, and we're going to move on to our third panelist tonight. We have with us Barry Tortolone from Rooster Hill Vineyards. And Barry has a blend. It's a Cab Franc Lemberger blend, which should be fun for you folks to try. And Barry is known, he's been in our industry in the Finger Lakes for a long time, and should also have some great insights for you folks tonight. And Barry, could you take us through, was there a vintage on that wine, or was it?
Yes, it's a 2011.
Okay, my notes didn't have the vintage on it. 2011, you want to tell us a little bit about how you made that wine, and a little bit maybe about, for you, whether the 2011 vintage brought some challenges for you and how you worked around those.
Cab Franc Lemberger at Rooster Hill, its inception was in 2007 when a majority of our vines on site came into production. And we have Cab Franc Lemberger, and then about an acre of each on site. So that year we put our first Cab Franc Lemberger blend together. 2007 was similar to 2005, 2001, and obviously 2010. It was a great red wine year, and we did all kinds of blending trials, 50-50, 60-40, 70-30, 90-10. We ran the gamut. It was one of those years that all those wines at those different ratios were very good. The 70-30 happened to be the one that jumped out of the glass, and that's kind of what we've stuck with since then. And it's become kind of a big seller for us. That outdoes our Cab Franc and our Cab Sauv. So when we get the chance, we try to make as much of this as we can. And once again, it's standard winemaking, red winemaking. It's time in the bins for color extraction, usually 10 to 14 days, and then the wines are kept separate till near the end. Both of them are aged in French and American oak, mostly older oak, and and I like to add in from a viticultural standpoint. It does really well on our site. The canopy's not too bad as far as being bushy. The clusters are nice and loose, so there's less disease pressure on them. And like we were talking earlier, it does hang quite a while, even in some years that are less than ideal here in the Finger Lakes.
So you're blending with that. It's not like every year it's going to be the same. It's just how it happens to work out that year for you when you're doing your blending trials. Barry, we had Dave Falchuk had asked a question. He thought it was a great wine, but what does Lemberger have to offer Cab Franc?
I think it kind of gives it a little more backbone, a little more aromatics that you wouldn't normally get. I mean, like Dave said earlier, once that gets a little bit riper, the black pepper does tend to subdue a little bit, but I think it adds a little more beef to it.
Also, probably bring in a little color too, right?
Yep. Although it's kind of funny on the site, a lot of people were talking about, how 11 was kind of, the faucets came on in September, which they did, and there was a big difference on sites that year. My 11 Lemberger and my 11 Pinot from the one block, the upper block, were more intense in color than the 2010. So, and sometimes
it doesn't work out exactly the way you think it's going to.
So,
this is just more of a general question for you, Barry. Someone had asked about our biggest challenges in growing red wine grapes in the Finger Lakes.
well, sometimes, having been here, and I know Dave was here in the early 80s, very early 80s, we had the Christmas massacre here where it dropped 50 degrees in 6 hours, but we haven't had that in over 30 years. Cool and wet years have been challenging, but really in the last 5 or 6 years, the thing that I think has really helped us leaps and bounds is canopy management in general. You know, getting the leaves pulled, getting those clusters exposed, and you know, thinking more about physiological ripeness than just sugars.
Any trends that you see, Barry, with red wine making in the Finger Lakes, that something that you see that's being done different besides the canopy management now that maybe from 15 years ago?
I don't know. I think just what I've changed in the last 10 years I've been at Rooster Hill, I've gone for longer maceration times. I'm not so much worried about the sugars and acids like I have been. I go out and I look for how ripe the seeds are, how ripe the skins are. You can definitely, if you chew into a grape seed, you can definitely tell whether you're close to ripeness or not, because you'll stand there and keep talking. But if things are green, you're moving on to the next block. So
with experience, like you're kind of getting a lot of physiological clues from the grape when it's time to pick, more than when you jump back to the lab.
yeah.
You got a pretty good idea when you get back there what you're going to find. So, well, very good. Let's see if we have any other questions coming in from our Twitter feed. And did I ask you for your suggested retail price yet on that one?
We're $20.
I already did. And we have one more question coming in. And you guys could all put your opinion in on this. We had a question from Dizelle Quillen. Any issues with name recognition from a sales perspective, since consumers are not familiar with the name Lemberger?
Yeah, I'll pipe in. We had a bit of trouble initially, and people said, you know, you mean that stinky cheese, and it's spelled differently, but we thought that was an insurmountable problem, and I think Dave, as a pioneer, a co-pioneer, would say the same thing. We thought this was going to be like the killer of this varietal, and it turns out that
People are smarter than we thought.
People are, yeah, no, let's just say that. And even though there's this Blau-Frankisch versus Lemberger dichotomy, consumers are generally like up to speed on that. If they like the wine, they're going to get familiar with the name.
And Dave and Barry, you guys kind of have the same feelings about it?
I think, we had a couple of our tasting room staff that coined the thing. When they talk to the people, they'd say there's nothing cheesy about this wine. So that was one approach. But I think now people are coming in and asking for it. I also think it's interesting that three of us are sitting here because Barry's wine is a Cabernet Franc Lemberger. There's, to my knowledge, 4 wineries in the Finger Lakes making it, and the three of us sitting here also all do that particular blend, different percentages probably. So, and I think that's been popular at each of the wineries. So Lemberger's added interest, I think, even to Cab Franc in some cases.
And we're not using the old world as a starting point for that idea. That's a Finger Lakes invention.
I think you may have touched on this, Barry, but someone had just tweeted in a question about the oak regiment for the Cab Franc and Lemberger.
I use I use French and American older oak barrels, and then depending on how much we have, we go into flex tanks with French oak cubes, and then because that's a little heavier, a little toastier, that gets to take care of some other wines, like a little bit in the Cab Sauv and a little bit in the regular Cab Franc varietal bottling as well.
Very good. Well, I want to thank our first group of panelists, and those of you who are kind of following our feed tonight, we're going to take a 5-minute break and bring in our next group of panelists. And thank you to Peter, Dave, and Barry. You guys did a great job. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff.
Welcome back to our second flight of the evening, and thank you for joining us. This flight, we're going to try a couple Pinot Noirs, and then we have a real treat with a couple of Russian varieties that are going to be put in a blend. First up this evening in our second flight, we have another long-term Finger Lakes winemaker who is Anne Raffetto. Anne is at Wagner Vineyards on the east side of Seneca Lake and has been there for a number of years. I'm not sure how many. But she does a great job. Wagner's has some beautiful vineyards, and they make some wonderful wines. And Anne is going to tell us a little bit about her 2010 Reserve Pinot Noir tonight. And then we'll throw a few questions at her about that Pinot Noir grape and how it works well for her. But Anne, would you like to take us through and tell us how you made the wine, a little bit about any challenges or things that came up with 2010 vintage with regards to Pinot Noir?
Okay.
And thank you.
Thank you. We have our 2010 Reserve Pinot Noir tonight, and I think, as was mentioned in the earlier flight with the winemakers, that 2010 was just a wonderful vintage for the vineyard group, the vineyard workers, and the winemakers. That just the wonderful amount of sunlight and rain at the right time, and so it sort of made everyone's job a bit easier. Pinot is probably more familiar to you than the Lembergers in the first flight, and grown in more regions. And it takes, fair to say, a fair amount of work in the vineyard. And that's probably why I'm here tonight, because the vineyard crew is probably out there in the vineyard. They spend a lot of time out in that block. But because of their good work, we can make wines that are really nice to drink and ageable. So the Reserve, what we try and do for our Reserve Pinot is the fruit just has to stand out, and there has to be a vibrancy to the fruit flavors, the fruity characteristics of the Pinot Noir grape. We're just going for that vibrance. And then the one thing that Pinot Noir can do that I think no other grape variety does as well is this just textural velvety sensation. So when we can get that, that's when we will label something as a Reserve Pinot Noir. And 2010 we were able to do it, 2007, and a few vintages before that too. I don't quite remember all of them. But that's sort of what we're striving in something that we'll label.
So for you, it's truly, in your mind, for Wagner's, it's a special product. That's not something that you're putting a label on every year. The wine must be up to
definitely not
your standard day.
Right, right. We do have another Pinot Noir that we have out every year, but the Reserve will just be in certain years. And when we do it, I mean, we don't do it necessarily in a small way either. I mean, these will be 300 or 400 case lots as Reserve. And so I think for that variety, that is a large case quantity.
So it's something that people could get their hands on
exactly.
based on the production.
Right, and I think that's something that Wagner strives for, is that we try and make wines that get out there, that are available. And since everyone has asked, this one is $27.99 and available in New York State through Southern Wine and Spirits.
Thank you very much.
And, very traditional winemaking, hand-picked grapes, fermentation on the skins until we have the color and the extraction that we want, into tanks for ml as quickly as that can happen, and then into barrel. We go into barrel fairly heavy sediment. I mean, the wine is still fairly cloudy, and we're using very old, neutral American oak barrels to start. So this wine was harvested, good year. We were harvested in late September. So this was into barrel by early November. And then sort of the routine is then June, July, we'll rack off the clear wine. We'll let the barrel settle. We use nitrogen displacement, being very gentle. Then reevaluate the oak and go back into either American and some old French oak. And then it's really barrel selection for the Reserve.
Great.
So that's sort of the winemaking. And I would be quite remiss if I did not speak about the vineyard that this came from. That our first Pinot Noir vineyard was planted in 1984, and that was the first red Vinifera that Wagner Vineyards planted, thinking that Pinot Noir was the appropriate grape with the short growing season, that we could ripen it. And after having that vineyard in production, when we're out there testing the vineyard, we noticed we had two different clones. And one really lent itself much better to red wine production. It was much, the berries themselves were larger and it was a looser cluster. Pinot Noir is a thin-skinned grape, so in that case, it was less prone to the looser clusters. The berries weren't so tight, and if one broke because there was less disease pressure, the intensity of the fruit flavors were stronger, and as was the color of the skin. So what we did, after having worked, keeping these separate in the winery and deciding, whoa, we like the lime better from that, we took budwood from that vineyard, had them grafted by a nursery, and then replanted a new vineyard at a site closer to the lake in 1997. So we've been working with that for about 12 years. And that's what this wine comes from. So, I mean, it was through sort of, vineyard and winery working together and selecting the best fruit for our site this vineyard has evolved, and we're pretty happy with this. And then it's all grown on the Scott Henry trellising system, I think was mentioned earlier. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this, I mean, grapes are vines and they just want to grow wild and everywhere. But this is a highly managed system which keeps the fruit in a zone about 14 or 16 inches. When I go to test the fruit in the fall, I mean, I'm sampling, you walk the rows to sample, decide when to pick and eat the grapes for flavor development. I mean, the fruit is just, it's hanging there like this, and there's leaves above and leaves below. I mean, it's just a sight to see. It's amazing, and I think that's what we have learned in the time that we've been growing Pinot Noir in this area, what it takes to do it.
Would you, one of the questions, Anne, which we kind of would throw out to you, given that trellis system and some of the extra work that you guys have done with Pinot, would you say that it was one of the more challenging red varieties to grow in the Finger Lakes?
Okay, so I'm indoors. I'm, like I said,
There's no problem for you.
The vineyard crew is in. They spend a lot of time in that vineyard, but it's definitely worth it. I mean, the stylish wines that Pinot can make, and especially in these cooler climates, that the alcohols and the acids, everything is balanced. I mean, there's a finesse to these wines, and that's what they can do. So, I mean, yes, they're not growing themselves, Jeff.
So you touched a little bit in, someone had asked about clonal selection and what are you looking for when growing Pinot Noir. Well, it sounded like Dazelle had asked this question. It sounded like you sort of answered for Wagner's. You guys isolated a clone that you liked and have replanted that clone. So, and I think some other folks have brought in different clones into the Finger Lakes to try and get away from the champagne clones and to get more red wine character. But I don't know. It sounds like for Wagner's, you guys found a clone that was working quite well.
Right.
And that's how been your approach to it.
I think, Jeff, too, it's just the evolution of time. That, I mean, I'm sure the owner then, Bill Wagner, had 8 or 10 acres ready to plant and called up the nursery and said, get me some Pinot.
Pinot.
Right. And now these things, I mean, it's a much more serious business, and a lot more research goes into decision making.
Okay.
I mean, it's an evolution of a growing industry.
Very neat. Well, I think we're going to take this opportunity to move on to our second panelist. Thank you very much, Ann.
Thanks, Jeff.
And we have with us this evening from Heron Hill Winery, we have Bernard Connick, the winemaker, and Bernard is going to talk to us about his Ingle Vineyard Pinot Noir 2009. And this will be kind of neat for folks who are tasting this evening. 2009, again, was a much different year than some of the other ones that we've tasted. So far, we've tried some 2010s and 2011s. So, Bernard, I think folks would be interested in what challenges that particular vintage brought to the winery, and if you could give us some more insight into how that wine was made.
Well, actually, this particular wine, 2009 Ingle Vineyard Pinot Noir, was my very first one I made at Heron Hill. And actually, when I was just moving to the area, I was making this wine, and 2009 was not a great year by any means. It was cold, it was challenging. 2010 was a breeze, it was perfect. 2009 was a cold year, it was hard for the reds. What did for the Pinot Noir is that it's early ripening varietal, so you can kind of dodge the bullet there. It has an early bud break as well, but it was. We also had a very small crop at Ingle Vineyard that year, and the decision was that, well, as the season was going, it just stayed cold. We didn't get the high temperatures that Pinot Noir requires, so the decision was taken to just drop some fruit and try to make the best red we could. John Ingle, the owner of Heron Hill Winery, has his own vineyard. He actually planted a vineyard back in 1972, and that's how he actually got started in the business. And he's got a very nice site on Canandaigua Lake, and all his wines come from this vineyard, and his Pinot is one of them. He has two blocks. One is about, I want to say, at least 30 years old. Another one a little younger, maybe 15 years old. So he's got like fairly old vines, not the most productive, but they actually yield a very good quality grapes. This one was just made in open fermenters. We did punch down. For what I understood at the time, the tradition there was to just ferment for a week. And when I saw the crew getting ready for pressing, I was like, what are you going to press? And like, well, the Pinot Noir, and I was like, whoa, wait, let me taste it first. And it could hang longer on the skin, so we just did a longer maceration, so they were kind of surprised on that. But even on 2009, which was a cooler year, but the seeds were ripe at crushing, so I had no problem just waiting to get all the tannins I could get from the skin, all the aromas I could get. So we extended the maceration there. Pinot Noir is a very tricky grape to grow, but I think that low yield is one key to the problem. It has thin skin, and you really need to find the right spot. I think that a lot of people have tried Pinot Noirs at very different vineyard locations. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So John was fortunate to find a vineyard where you can grow pretty much anything you want, and it works. So we are very lucky in that. And then the aging, the maceration was maybe, I would say, at least 3 weeks, between 3 to 4 weeks on the skin. Malolactic fermentation was done in tank. I'd rather do it in tank just to have it in control, under better control, and then it was aged for about 2 years in French and Eastern European oak.
Very good.
And they were all used barrels.
Someone had a question about the oak regiment. They'd asked whether to use a specific barrel made by variety, or do you taste the fruit and then plan how long you're going to have it in oak and what type of barrel you're going to use?
Well, it depends on the wine, but as a general way, I like to have a nice variety of barrels within the same lot, just to give me a lot of possibilities when blending time comes. And it's fun too because I get to try every single barrel.
Definitely.
Yeah.
My favorite part of it.
I'm trying to make it harder on myself. So, but it's like being able to, the more variables you have, the better it is to come up with a nice blend. For Ingle Vineyard, it's because it's a single vineyard wine. Pretty much it is what it is. So I tend to use, because it's a Pinot Noir, I don't use new oak, because new oak tend to extract too much tannins and mark the wine too much. So it's usually all the barrels that I use, and it's usually French and Eastern European Hungarian oak. Not too much American oak, although it can work, like I was showing. But for me, American oak, like traditionally, will just give out a lot of oak quickly. So again, that can mark the wines with tannins pretty heavily. So for the same reason, I don't really like to use American oak on lighter wine like a Pinot Noir. So we go with French oak, which typically has a smaller grain, tends to release tannins longer, which means less at one time, and it's more elegant, subtle in a way. So if you have a rich wine, let's say like a Cabernet Sauvignon or Cabernet Franc, then I would have some American oak in it. But then on a lighter wine, I would use more French. And I like the Hungarian oak because it gives some spiciness to it, more like cloves, aromas, which I don't find very, I actually find good in a blend. So I think that the combination of the two oaks on the Pinot Noir works well.
What was the price on that wine, Bernard?
$20.
$20.
$19.
And could people find it around? What's the distribution?
Well, actually, this is in California, the wines are retail only, so you can find them at our tasting rooms. So we have a tasting room at the winery on Cuca Lake in Amersfoort, and we have 2 satellite tasting rooms, one on Seneca Lake in Him Road, and another tasting room in South Bristol on Canandaigua Lake. And you can also order it online.
Very good. Well, while we're still on Pinot Noir, I had a question for both Anne and for you, Bernard. We had a couple of folks who'd asked about food pairings with your wines. And I'm going to ask each of you if you could give people a recommendation for something they might pair with your Pinot.
Would you like to go first?
Sure. I'm not much of a meat eater, so we drink a lot of Pinot with our vegetarian meals. I like to match it with a lot of eggplant dishes, and there's something with mushrooms, the earthiness of mushrooms that comes out with Pinot Noir. So.
Very good.
And
Thank you.
Any salmon too.
Yeah.
How about for you, Bernard?
I am a meat eater. But usually I would have, like Anne said, it's Pinot Noir is very, it has a lot of earthy notes, and anything with game, like I'm thinking quail, rabbit, venison, and also any like broccoli rabe, asparagus, this kind of very, I was almost saying aggressive, but they're very like earthy vegetables.
Great. Thank you guys very much. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but that's what we're here for.
I think we like to eat.
So I had one other general question for you, Bernard. Would you compare Finger Lakes Reds to other regions, and particular Pinot Noir, or do you feel they're strictly unique to the Finger Lakes, or do you feel that there can be like a comparison made?
I think there is not a lot to, into trying to compare ourselves to another region. I think that Finger Lakes, we are trying to find our identity. So maybe we are in the teenage years. But I don't think there is any reason or to try to compare ourselves. If we go Pinot Noir, why should we look into Burgundy, let's say? Well, we are different in Burgundy. We don't have the same soil. Our growing conditions are different. So our wines will be different. Why would we be, comparing ourselves to Oregon? Because we have different, again, different soil, different growing conditions, and for each varietal, that's. I don't think we would gain anything trying to copy somebody else or to compare ourselves to another region, even though they are very successful in brewing a certain grape or a certain varietal. I think we just have to find our own way. And within the Finger Lakes, I think that because we have so many different sites, locations, for me the Finger Lakes is just a mosaic, really, and each block is going to give something different. Even within a mile, 2 blocks will just behave totally differently, even if they have a similar soil composition.
One more quick question for you, Bernard, and then I'm going to move on to John. We'd had a question about Pinot Noir under screw caps and whether or not you wanted to chime in on that. And Anne, you can quickly, since you do some wines with screw caps, you could also give your opinion on that.
Would you like to go first?
We do use screw caps on Sylvans on some of our white production. We haven't started that with the reds yet. It's a big this is a big decision to make, and sort of the last winemaking decision to make for a winemaker, the type of closure. So we're going to do more research on that before we.
Very good.
Yes, we have started to have some Stelvin screw cap on our whites for 2 years now. It works well. We are very happy with it. On the reds, I think it's a harder jump to make. On fruity whites, a screw cap will preserve the fruitiness and the sharpness and the freshness of the wine, which is what you are looking for into white wine. So that works. Now for red, you need this bottle aging, and one way to get the bottle aging is through the natural cork. So there have been some new developments on a seal for screw cap that will be semi-permeable, allowing air to go through the closure to mimic the aging. But I think it's too early to say whether it works or not. So right now we are happy with using natural corks. So we will keep natural corks on our reds for now.
Very good. Well,
Pinot Noir
thank you very much for both of you guys answering that question. And thank you, Bernard. And we're going to take this opportunity to move on to our last panelist of the evening. And we have with us John McGregor, one of the owners of Wagner Vineyards. And John has a little treat for you folks. And after having Pinot Noir, I would have a little cracker and get your palate ready, because these are different styles. These are very different styles of wines. And John is going to tell us a little bit about his 2008 Black Russian Red. He'll talk about the grapes that were in it, how the wine was made, and maybe you can touch a little bit, John, on this is our only 2008 wine of this evening. So welcome, John, and we're glad to have you here, and tell us all about it.
This is a blended wine of 2 Eastern European grape varietals, Separavi being the first, which is one of the oldest known winemaking grapes. It's more common, or I guess most common, to Georgia, and it's been used in winemaking for thousands of years. It's blended with another grape varietal called Syrexia charni. It's of Romanian or Moldovan origin, and it's known over there as Babeska Niagara, and I'm sure I'm killing that name. It's grandmother's grape, really. Very obscure grapes. It's something that happened upon us by chance. We've been growing them since 1980. And it actually has turned out to be very well suited to our climate in the Finger Lakes. These are grapes that tend to have very loose clusters, so disease is a little bit more kept at bay. The interesting thing about them, they tend to have a very high acid. You can have a great year like 2010, 2007, 2012. It doesn't matter how ripe the grapes get, you tend to have that incredible ripeness and fruit balanced by high acidity. So you're getting something that is a little bitey early on, and that speaks to this 2008 vintage being here right now. This wine, over time, we've been making this blend since '91. What we've found is that really for this wine to settle into its own, you need a good 6 to 8 years out. Here we are 5 years out, and it's starting to be quite approachable. The fruit and the oak and the tannins are starting to really balance themselves, but time is something of the essence for this wine. So, pretty interesting.
Definitely. What would you have for a classic food pairing with the Black Russian?
I think a lot of gamey meats, and you're talking to a vegetarian here, but so I've been told. And actually, I can still conceptualize in my mind that this is a wine that holds up to rather strong flavored food dishes. I can certainly tell you that very dark chocolate dishes pair quite nicely with this wine.
For Finger Lakes, this you would classify as a little bit bigger, bolder wine
Sure.
than a lot of the wines that people are going to have a chance to try from the Finger Lakes.
Sure.
And I think that shows like the depth of different styles that can be made in the region, and it's
Yeah, it's something that we're as far as vinifera go, and as far as red vinifera go, we're a baby region. It's something we've only been doing for 30, 40 years, as opposed to hundreds of years. So we certainly are purveyors of some of the oldest vinifera red winemaking tradition that is in the region. It's a work in progress. We're starting to figure out what works out here. Cabernet Franc, Lemberger. I would even very much argue that Cabernet Sauvignon. You just do not want to try to approach our winemaking style and what we can do here with something in California, Oregon. We're different, and I think that's something that we need to just stand up on our own about. Pinot Noir is one of the greatest grapes that we can be growing here. So
the varietals in the Black Russian. We could probably, on one hand, count the number of vineyards that those are grown in the Finger Lakes.
Sure.
So it's a fairly unique product from McGregor, and so seek it out. It's a pretty neat wine. I've had a chance to enjoy it many times myself.
I'd have to say I'm real happy that Separavi, one of the varietals that's in this blend, is now being grown by a few others in the region after 30 plus years of watching us struggle with it and start to get a handle on it. That others are starting to say, yeah, this is something that has a viability in the area. So it's great.
So is that wine available outside of the winery, John?
It is distributed. We are pretty much only in New York State, distributed down into New York City through Upstate Wine Company, across New York State through O-Pee-Chee, and ask for it.
What was the price?
Bitterness.
Hold on, everyone.
The bitterness of poor quality remains long after the sweetness of low price is forgotten. It's a $54 bottle of wine, this vintage. I price it by vintage. So, it ranges from $50 to $60 a bottle.
Someone Dave Falchuk had just tweeted in a question about why we're not seeing more of those. You guys have had some success with this wine. Why we are not seeing more vineyards try those varietals?
You are. That's
Well, I know
you
I'm familiar with, I believe, Standing Stone.
Standing
planted
Stone,
them.
Dr. Franks has started planting Separavi.
But still,
Syrexia is I mean, Syrexia is, as far as we know, is unique to us in this country. It's an obscure grape. No one in my family has tried Syrexia from Moldova, from Romania. It's just that obscure. It's a happenstance thing. Separavi a little more so, but there's a few vineyards growing that, and it has very great potential here. Honestly, though, it's as far as it grows well, but once you bring it into the winery, it's difficult. You've got very high acids to deal with, and if you have an off year in our, I wouldn't even argue cool climate. This is a cold climate. You're going to have very difficult issues with creating a balanced wine. So I mean, it's very unforgiving. It's not easy.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, John. And on behalf of the Finger Lakes Wine Alliance, we would love to thank all of our media members who tasted with us this evening. And thank you to our three panelists. You guys did a great job. And thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Salud.
Thank you.
Bye.
Something.
Cheers.
Okay, that one.